Since the age of the ancient philosophers and even during the Enlightenment, there have been a multitude of different philosophical and theological views concerning reality and the world around us. But few of these views have truly stood the test of time. At the very most, some of these views are merely resurfaced in the modern day, but they last only for a brief moment. We do see one view in particular stand out and shine above all others. This is evidently the writings and thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor. St. Thomas synthesized the thought of Aristotle and the Christian faith with perfection. This synthesis may be called the pinnacle of scholasticism, scholasticism being the idea of synthesizing the Catholic or Christian faith with earlier classical philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. And since the time of St. Thomas in the 13th century and even before, this worldview or system of philosophy and theology reigned above all others. This was until the 16th and 17th century, when the Enlightenment came around, and men who grew tired of the scholastic tradition threw it out, and out of pride thought that they could reinvent the wheel and make their own system of philosophy starting from the ground up. As Paul J. Glenn notes, and why did they succumb to such weakness? Because men are children of a fallen sire. Men always tend to grow lazy and slipshod, and when they have once given way to intellectual laziness and have begun to suffer from the ill equipment that comes of it, men resent guidance. They fret at the exactions of study. They begin to wonder whether, after all, the laborious ancients and the lauded masters were not making much ado about nothing, or at least about a very little. Now, the very soul of such resentful fretting is pride. When pride takes hold of the mind, real scholarship dies. But interestingly, rather than creating a brand new system of philosophy, they conjured up the ancient errors of the past philosophers. Ancient errors including positions like materialism, in which everything is just matter and motion colliding with each other. There were also others who put an overemphasis on the mind. Men like Descartes resurrected the false view of how our mind or soul works. He merely saw our physical bodies as containers for our soul, and really nothing more. Many of these false views of the Enlightenment also led to a type of universal or absolute skepticism, in which one doubts that he knows anything at all, even logic itself. Such views are clearly repugnant to sound philosophical reasoning and a proper outlook of the world. Even though the age of the Enlightenment has ended, many of these errors still creep up into the modern day. But we who hold so dearly to St. Thomas and the scholastic tradition need not necessarily to fret. For in the midst of this chaos, Pope Leo XIII, in his famous encyclical, Aeterni Patris, writes that while therefore we hold that every word of wisdom, every useful thing by whomever so discovered or planned, ought to be received with a willing and grateful mind, we exhort you, venerable brethren, in all earnestness to restore the golden wisdom of St. Thomas, and to spread it far and wide for the defense and beauty of the Catholic faith. This encyclical was a call to a type of scholastic or Thomistic revival within the Church and universities across the world, and it truly did become a revival in the 19th and 20th century. But towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, we have seen a sharp decline, and it seems that the thoughts and beliefs of modernism have yet again taken control of intellectual discussion. Now that we've covered a brief history of Thomism or scholasticism and its aggressors, for this first lecture let us therefore start at the very foundation of intellectual disputation, which can be broadly called epistemology or criteriology by many later scholastics, which is itself the study of knowledge and how we obtain it. For a question arises, can we be sure that we have knowledge at all? And where does this knowledge begin or come from? As a side note, if you want to help support me, consider buying my new released merchandise, which is based on St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for any support. At the beginning, before any knowledge exists in the mind, the human person senses the world around him through his senses. These of course being touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. These are the external senses. There are also internal senses, but we won't cover them here. The human mind takes in this sense information or material, and from it apprehends intelligible being. In other words, we apprehend or abstract or take out of the fact that these things have existence or being. From the fact that we abstract or apprehend being or existence, we are able to ground or base first principles also known by some as the laws of logic. Cardinal Mercier describes first principles as such, that there are a certain number of judgments which deal with the most elementary relations of being and non-being. They are of universal application and of evident necessity, and therefore serve as directing and controlling principles for every assertion and every reasoning process. For example, the very first principle the mind comes to know is the principle of non-contradiction, or that being is not non-being. St. Thomas writes, "That which first falls into apprehension is being, the understanding of which is included in all things that someone can grasp. Therefore, the first indemonstrable principle is that we cannot affirm and deny, or being is not non-being, which is founded on the formal character of being and non-being. And this principle is the foundation for all the other principles, as the philosopher says in Metaphysics Book 4, Chapter 3. And further, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange writes, "The first object known by our intellect is the intelligible being of sensible things, in its primordial opposition to non-being. The first principles are laws of thought, only because they are first laws of being and of reality. From the outset, it is utterly clear that reality cannot at once be reality and non-reality." What is being utilized here is the peripatetic axiom, which states that nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses. Essentially, as followers of Aristotelian epistemology, we believe that intellectual cognition begins or stems from the senses, and not, for example, the rationalists, like Descartes, who believe that knowledge is innate or can exist before sense experience. This is a blatant error that he brings forth from the Platonic tradition. For in the tradition of Aristotle and St. Thomas, the mind is called a tabula rasa, or blank slate, before any sensory experience. St. Thomas, refuting Plato's error of innatism, states, "On the contrary, the philosopher, speaking of the intellect, says that it is like a tablet on which nothing is written. First, because if the soul has a natural knowledge of all things, it seems impossible for the soul so far to forget the existence of such knowledge as not to know itself to be possessed thereof. For no man forgets what he knows naturally, that for instance the whole is larger than the part, and such like. And especially unreasonable does this seem if we suppose that it is natural to the soul to be united to the body, as we have established above. For it is unreasonable that the natural operation of a thing be totally hindered by that which belongs to it naturally." With the non-contradiction having been established by the idea of being, other first principles also come forth. For example, the principle of identity, which states that being is being and non-being is non-being, as well the principle of excluded middle, which states that there is nothing between being and non-being, or put differently, between affirmation and denial, there is no middle course or choice. In every judgment made and reasoned conclusion, these principles must be assumed and used, for to doubt them, one must necessarily use them. For example, in order to refute the principle of non-contradiction, one has to use the very same principle, for argumentation itself relies on it. As well, these principles cannot be proved directly, as for example in a syllogism, for they are self-evident truths or proofs in themselves, though they can be argued for indirectly, in that one can refute the arguments brought forward against them, and therefore one is left to merely accept the principles. A question may arise, though, in that how can we trust our senses, which are the very source of our knowledge? But first, let us go through how our intellect is both passive and active, before refuting the error that the external world around us cannot be known with certitude. Now, our intellect is passive insofar as it has the potential towards objects around us, which it can know, for example. As Cardinal Cajetan thus explains, our intellect, therefore, is in passive potency towards the intelligible object, and the act of understanding is undergoing a causal impact, because it is from an impact by the intelligible object, i.e., from receiving the intelligible object. Therefore, once our intellect has received an object of sense, for example a book, our active intellect abstracts the essence, or what it is to be of this book, so that we can know what it is. Wherefore, St. Thomas, quoting Aristotle, writes, "The philosopher says, as in every nature, so in the soul is there something by which it becomes all things, and something by which it makes all things. Therefore we must admit an active intellect." Thus, we now have a grasp of how our intellect operates using the senses, in which we take sense data or material and abstract the form or essence of that thing. Wherefore, Father Robert Brennan goes a little deeper into explaining the process. He writes, "The ability to abstract, he, St. Thomas, calls agent intellect. The ability to understand, he names possible intellect. The functions of agent intellect are active or creative. The functions of possible intellect are passive or receptive. The proper object of sense is a sensible, but a sensible is only potentially intelligible. As a datum of sense, it is material. In order to be understood, it must be made immaterial. The datum of sense is presented to agent intellect in the form of an image or phantasm. It has all the concrete characters of a material object. It is the product of a material power enveloped in material conditions. It belongs to the category of the here and now. It is, in short, individualized. The act of illumination, which is proper to agent intellect, is brought to bear on the phantasm or sensible image. The concrete characters of the datum of sense are left aside. This is the movement of abstraction. Only the nude nature of the object represented in the phantasm remains. But a nude nature, or nature stripped of its individuating notes, is something capable of being understood. The content of the phantasm, sensible image, is no longer material and determinate, but has been raised to the level of intelligibility. But how do we know the sense information is reliable? For example, the empiricist David Hume admits that one may be mistaken, and that our mind is conjuring up these false senses. But this is illogical on the pain of falling into reductio ad absurdum. Essentially, this position is impossible, for it makes knowledge itself impossible. Reverend Charles Coppins responds as such to this issue. Nothing exists without a reason for it, but there exist in us, as we know by consciousness, sensations, irresistible judgments, that those sensations are caused by bodies, i.e. by substances distinct from our mind, extended and resisting. Therefore, a reason must exist for those sensations, and for those irresistible judgments. But that reason can be none other than bodies really existing, therefore they really exist. We prove the last minor. If that reason were not in the bodies, it would be in our minds, as Fichte maintains. Now, it is not in our minds. If it were, we should produce those sensations and judgments necessarily or freely, but we do neither. Not freely, for we see, hear, feel, etc. many things which we are totally unwilling to see, hear, feel, etc. Not necessarily, for if we were so constituted that we necessarily elicited false judgments, our intellect would be essentially unreliable. It would be a power not of knowing truth, but of deception and falsification. Some in the modern day try to level more modern objections. For example, they say that an evil scientist could be producing these deceptions to our brains. For example, our brains could just be in a vat, hooked up to a machine. Or they argue that we may even be in the Matrix. Now, there are multiple issues with these scenarios. For example, free will would be made impossible, and therefore it's impossible by itself already. But a more specific issue arises. Reverend Charles Coppins states again that we deny this, for the deception, if it were, would be not accidental, but natural and essential to man, and therefore it would be essential to man to judge falsely, and thus universal skepticism would be reasonable. For our brains would be so constituted as to take in sense information which is false, and therefore knowledge would have to be impossible, for the senses are the basis of knowledge. But if knowledge is made impossible, then we have been led into an impossible position that cannot be taken logically. Now, of course, that is not to say that when we receive sense data that it always lines up perfectly to reality. That is the point of abstraction in the active intellect. Wherefore, Father Peter Coffey writes, "The possibility of error lies in the fact that human cognition is not a mere passive intuition or mirroring of reality by the mind, but an active process whereby the mind abstracts excessive aspects of the given reality, analyzes and synthesizes, separates and reunites these aspects, thus gradually interpreting or representing intelligibly to itself or reconstructing intelligibly for itself the presented reality." Thus, we need not to fret about epistemology, for our answers lie within the thought of Aristotle, which was perfected by St. Thomas. Thus, this concludes this brief video on Thomistic or Scholastic Epistemology or Criteriology. In the next lecture, we shall go into a much greater depth in regards to logic, which is the art of reasoning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. As always, God bless.